Oh, welcome, you beautiful system anomaly. A billionaire signed a $2 million check without ceremony, not for anything tangible or indulgent, but for understanding. And that alone should tell you how serious it was, because this wasn't curiosity or vanity or trend chasing, it was concern. The money didn't go to markets or technology or politics, but to a private research firm that doesn't advertise, doesn't publish, and doesn't exist in any place you could point to on a map. The kind of firm that governments quietly retain when they need to understand movements before they form and fractures before they surface. And the brief they were given was deceptively simple. Identify a specific psychological pattern, map how individuals who carry it think and decide, and determine whether they can be predicted, influenced, or neutralized before they destabilize the systems around them. The pattern wasn't criminality or brilliance or rebellion. It was something far more unsettling. People who don't respond to pressure the way they're supposed to. People who remain functional where others fragment. People who move through stress with an unsettling calm that makes observers uneasy without knowing why. And when the researchers began pulling case studies, behavioral data, and historical parallels, a disturbing consistency emerged. These individuals weren't loud or charismatic in the conventional sense. They didn't seek power or attention, and yet their presence alone altered dynamics, shifted outcomes, and exposed weaknesses in environments that had otherwise appeared stable. When the researchers began interviews and assessments, they noticed something even more uncomfortable. The subjects themselves often didn't think of this as a strength. Many had spent years assuming something was wrong with them, wondering why therapists hesitated, why friendships thinned without clear conflict, why authority figures reacted defensively despite flawless performance, why experiences that devastated others seemed to strip them down and then rebuild them into something sharper, colder, and harder to categorize. The data confirmed what the subjects had only felt privately. This wasn't personality in the traditional sense, because the existing models were built to describe people who depend on systems for validation, safety, and meaning, and these individuals did not. Under pressure, where most people showed rising anxiety followed by degradation, this group demonstrated increased clarity, emotional regulation, and decisiveness, as if crisis activated something dormant rather than overwhelming it. Standard motivators barely registered. Money, recognition, status, and security produced minimal behavioral change, while internal drivers, transformation, coherence, self-directed meaning produced disproportionate response, and that imbalance alone made them difficult to model, because you cannot reliably predict someone who doesn't want what you can offer. As one internal memo quietly noted, these subjects were not anti-system in the ideological sense. They simply functioned without needing the system's approval, and that made them invisible until they weren't. By the end of the first phase, the research team was no longer asking whether this pattern existed. They were asking how long it had been forming, how many people already carried it, and why no one had named it before. That was the moment the project stopped feeling academic and started feeling urgent, because understanding this pattern wasn't about classification anymore. It was about recognizing a type of human psychology that didn't bend where others did, didn't collapse where others were designed to, and might represent not an anomaly, but an early signal of something larger unfolding beneath the surface of a world built on predictability. When the first phase failed to produce clean answers, the researchers escalated, moving beyond surveys and behavioral interviews into physiological and neurological territory, convinced that if the mind wouldn't reveal itself through language, the body would tell the truth instead. And this was where the project began to unsettle even the people paid to remain detached. Subjects matching the profile were placed under continuous biometric monitoring, heart rate variability, cortisol response, neural activity, micro-expressions, while exposed to scenarios engineered to trigger fundamental human threat responses: social exclusion, sudden loss, moral compromise, simulated failure, and perceived danger, the kinds of stressors that reliably fracture most personalities along well-documented lines. What emerged was not emotional absence, but emotional override. The fear centers activated exactly as expected, but they were consistently subordinated by higher-order cognitive control in real time, not through suppression or denial, but through conscious redirection, as though fear was being processed as information rather than command. One senior neuroscientist, previously involved in military stress resilience programs, flagged the data repeatedly, arguing that the response pattern didn't align with adaptation models or trauma compensation theories, and after 3 weeks he exited the project without completing his contract, leaving behind a single remark in an internal debrief that quietly circulated despite attempts to contain it. This isn't resilience we're observing, it's structural divergence. These individuals aren't recovering from stress, they're operating on a different emotional architecture altogether. That line changed the tone of the entire study, because divergence implies trajectory, and trajectory implies consequence. As testing continued, researchers noticed that attempts to intensify pressure produced diminishing destabilization effects, and in some cases appeared to sharpen focus, decision speed, and emotional coherence, a phenomenon later labeled adversarial growth, where obstacles functioned as accelerants rather than impediments. Efforts to induce compliance through authority cues, shame signaling, or reward manipulation consistently failed, not through defiance but through indifference, as if those levers simply didn't connect to the internal machinery governing behavior. Even more troubling was the variability. Responses could not be standardized because subjects didn't rely on fixed identity structures, adapting their internal narratives fluidly without losing core coherence, which rendered prediction models unreliable beyond short time horizons. By the midpoint of this phase, the research team began shifting language in internal communications, abandoning terms like personality type in favor of process and developmental state, acknowledging that they were no longer observing stable traits but ongoing transformation. This reframing raised an unspoken concern that hovered over the project. If this psychological configuration wasn't static, then containment strategies based on categorization would fail, and any attempt to freeze or manage it might instead provoke further divergence. What had started as an effort to understand a difficult subset of people was quietly becoming an inquiry into whether certain humans were reorganizing themselves under sustained pressure in ways existing psychological frameworks were never designed to detect, let alone control. By the time the project entered its longitudinal phase, the original objective had quietly collapsed, because the question was no longer whether these individuals could be understood in isolation, but whether their trajectories obeyed any of the rules that governed human development at all. And this is where the data began to genuinely unsettle the people compiling it. Tracking subjects across decades rather than months revealed that their lives did not follow linear progressions or recognizable success curves. Instead of climbing predictable ladders, they disappeared from one context and resurfaced in another at entirely different levels, often abandoning positions of stability without crisis or obvious gain, only to re-emerge later with greater leverage, clarity, or autonomy than before. Careers showed abrupt pivots that defied conventional risk analysis. Relationships formed with unusual intensity and then dissolved just as cleanly, and social circles reorganized repeatedly around the subject rather than the subject integrating into existing structures, creating a pattern the analysts described as magnetization and repulsion rather than attachment and belonging. What disturbed them most was the absence of deterioration, where instability typically correlates with burnout, fragmentation, or decline. These individuals displayed sustained cognitive sharpness, emotional regulation, and adaptability, well past the age when most personalities settle into fixed patterns. Psychological profiles taken at 30, 40, and 50 years old showed continued evolution rather than consolidation, suggesting that identity itself remained a flexible instrument rather than a finished product, and this alone violated foundational assumptions in developmental psychology. Attempts to correlate outcomes with early advantage, education, socioeconomic background, or institutional support failed repeatedly because the same functional role appeared regardless of context. These individuals consistently became the variable that altered systems from within, not through ambition or manipulation, but through an intensity of coherence that exposed inefficiencies, contradictions, and unspoken compromises others had learned to tolerate. Analysts found them as founders who dismantled their own organizations rather than dilute core principles, as creatives who walked away from visibility when it demanded self-censorship, as employees removed not for incompetence, but for making peers and superiors uncomfortable with their refusal to perform psychological submission. One internal report noted that their presence often improved systems temporarily before destabilizing them, not because of sabotage, but because the system could not integrate someone who functioned without its incentives, and over time the friction became untenable. Perhaps most disconcerting was the finding that these individuals did not accumulate influence in the traditional sense. They left imprints rather than legacies, altering trajectories without remaining to manage outcomes, which made them nearly impossible to track through standard impact metrics. By the end of this phase, several analysts independently reached the same conclusion, one that was never formally published. This was not a population that converged toward equilibrium, and any attempt to forecast their behavior beyond narrow windows produced compounding error, because what they were observing was not deviation from the norm but continuous self-directed transformation, a process that resisted stabilization and suggested that the real anomaly was not these individuals themselves, but the assumption that human identity was ever meant to stop evolving in the first place. The project crossed a line when outside specialists were brought in, not psychologists or clinicians, but analysts trained to assess large-scale risk, the kind of people tasked with modeling radicalization, social contagion, and systemic failure, because by this point the concern was no longer individual outcomes, but what might happen if enough of these individuals began to recognize one another. Using demographic data, trauma exposure trends, and cultural indicators, the team built simulations to test threshold effects, asking not how one such person behaves in isolation, but how environments change when their numbers reach critical mass, and the results were consistent enough to alarm even the most conservative reviewers. In every model, once density passed a certain point, existing power structures did not adapt, radicalize, or retaliate. They simply lost relevance. Participation declined without protest, compliance eroded without coordination, and parallel systems emerged not as movements but as practical alternatives, drawing people away through functionality rather than ideology. There were no leaders to negotiate with, no demands to suppress, no centralized narratives to discredit, because the behavior driving the shift wasn't oppositional, it was self-directed. Attempts to introduce fear-based controls, symbolic authority, or status incentives failed to re-engage the group, producing instead increased disengagement and accelerated independence, as if the pressure itself validated their internal logic. Analysts noted with unease that traditional countermeasures were ineffective, precisely because these individuals did not define themselves in relation to the system at all, making them immune to the push-pull mechanisms that maintain social order. One report framed the phenomenon as nonviolent systemic exit, a slow emptying rather than a confrontation, and flagged it as uniquely difficult to manage because it offered no focal point for intervention. By this stage, internal communications shifted again, abandoning language of threat and pathology in favor of inevitability, and it became clear that the original mandate to identify, predict, and neutralize had quietly failed on all three counts. What the models suggested was not a rebellion that could be suppressed, but a form of psychological independence that scaled organically, spreading through example rather than persuasion, and the implication no one wanted to say aloud was that systems built on participation and compliance cannot survive widespread indifference, especially when that indifference is paired with the capacity to build something functional in its place. The final stage brought in a philosopher, not a scientist, to address the question that no amount of data could answer: what do these people believe? For 3 weeks, journals were read, interviews conducted, life narratives deconstructed, and the result was a document that the corporate and intelligence worlds treated as dangerously heretical. The philosopher concluded that this personality type was not better or worse, not more moral or more intelligent, but operating on a fundamentally different plane of consciousness, what he called post-tribal awareness. Whereas most humans derive safety, meaning, and identity from external validation, approval from peers, social hierarchies, cultural norms, these individuals generate their own frameworks internally, constructing coherence and purpose independent of the tribe, independent of approval, independent of expectation. Survival and trauma forced it. Necessity was their teacher. Their psychology was not a deviation, but a prerequisite adaptation to environments where old certainties had failed. And this mode of consciousness, he argued, was contagious. When one person embodies it fully, it influences others around them through example, not coercion. When enough people do, entire systems begin to destabilize simply because dependence, fear, and social obligation no longer function as levers. The philosopher's report projected a population-level trajectory. Within 2 decades, the share of people exhibiting this profile could reach 15 to 20% of adults in certain societies, enough to fundamentally alter economic, political, and cultural dynamics. Existing institutions, designed to rely on compliance, predictability, and external validation, would no longer maintain their influence, not through revolution or violence, but through simple functional redundancy. The conclusions were so disturbing that the report was buried, the philosopher blacklisted, and the billionaire who funded the study diverted attention and resources towards strengthening conventional systems instead, attempting to hedge against a future they no longer understood. Yet the data persists in encrypted archives, quietly studied by analysts who know that the phenomena it describes are real and accelerating. These individuals cannot be controlled, cannot be shamed, cannot be bought, and cannot be predicted, not because they are reckless, but because they are self-sufficient, capable of thriving outside the frameworks most people assume are necessary for life. Attempts to suppress or manipulate them only accelerate their independence, and the research shows a recurring pattern. The more pressure applied, the more their focus, capability, and coherence increase. They do not burn out, they intensify. They do not conform, they evolve. And what terrifies the world that studied them is not a rebellion, not a crisis, not an event. It is the slow, unstoppable emergence of a new form of human consciousness, a process that cannot be halted, controlled, or contained, because it is not external, it is intrinsic, growing quietly, invisibly, in anyone forced to generate meaning, coherence, and power from within, rather than from the systems around them. What makes this all so extraordinary? And why the $2 million price tag was not for idle curiosity? Is that the study did more than describe these individuals. It identified markers, early predictors, patterns visible in childhood, subtle responses to rejection and challenge, ways of processing isolation that reliably foreshadowed later development into this profile. The implications were as clear as they were unsettling. This is not an anomaly reserved for a few exceptional people, but a pattern that is increasing in prevalence, particularly among younger generations who have grown up with systems already failing around them, never able to rely on old certainties, forced to forge their own identities amidst collapse and contradiction. The projections suggest that within 20 years, this personality type could constitute 1 in 5 adults, enough to alter the dynamics of work, governance, culture, and social cohesion on a fundamental level. And here lies the part the financiers, analysts, and intelligence operatives struggled with. People like this cannot be co-opted, cannot be predicted, cannot be controlled by fear, reward, or social expectation. They operate on principles internal to themselves, seeking truth, transformation, and integrity in ways that are incompatible with conventional levers of influence. Attempts to suppress, shame, or manipulate them invariably backfire, accelerating their growth, sharpening their focus, and reinforcing their independence. They are not a problem to be solved, they are a process to be observed, a force that evolves faster than the models designed to contain it. And in practical terms, this means that when enough of these individuals emerge, connect, and recognize each other, entire systems, economic, political, social, will begin to operate differently, not through conflict, protest, or overt revolution, but through simple functional refusal, non-compliance, self-organization, the creation of parallel structures that render obsolete the old hierarchies and dependencies. In other words, the research revealed not a group to fear, but a world quietly transforming before conventional eyes, a population whose very existence will force adaptation not by choice of the majority, but by the inevitability of their presence. The billionaire who commissioned the work spent the money attempting to bury the implications, funding projects to shore up dependency, cohesion, and compliance. But the reality the research uncovered cannot be contained, and it cannot be reversed. The rise of this personality type is already underway, growing with each generation that learns to survive, to think independently, and to find meaning from within, rather than through the systems designed to keep them in line. And for the individuals who carry this pattern, the ones who have always sensed, often alone, that they were different, this is not a warning. It is recognition. It is evidence that what has always set them apart is exactly what makes them essential to what is coming next, and that no matter how much the world wants to predict, control, or contain, it cannot stop the transformation that is already in motion. And here's the part that turns fear into power. The part the $2 million was really buying but couldn't suppress. The research confirmed what the subjects already sensed. Every attempt to control, manipulate, or diminish them only accelerates their development. Pressure does not break them, it hones them. Isolation doesn't weaken them, it teaches self-reliance. Shaming, bribing, coercing. These tactics fail spectacularly because the underlying architecture of their psychology is immune to the levers that govern ordinary human behavior. Analysts called it adversarial growth, the phenomenon where obstacles, threats, and challenges don't impede progress but amplify it, producing heightened focus, clarity, and resilience. Unlike most people who avoid pain, seek comfort, and optimize for predictability, your type thrives in chaos, boredom, and difficulty, gaining power precisely where the world assumes they will falter. Longitudinal data showed they live longer, remain cognitively sharper, sustain higher satisfaction, and engage with life more deeply than those who play it safe, defying conventional metrics of burnout or decline. Their lives are not linear, they are catalytic. They leave imprints wherever they go, not because they pursue control, fame, or influence, but simply because the intensity of their presence exposes weaknesses in every system they enter. Attempts to fit them into social, corporate, or political molds fail not by accident but by design. They cannot be corralled, predicted, or contained because they operate according to internal principles, not external incentives. And that is what truly terrifies those who study, fund, or attempt to control human behavior. You cannot be bought, coerced, shamed, or predicted. You are not a problem to fix. You are a force that exists independently of the systems built to contain it. This is why the study was shut down, why reports were buried, why analysts were reassigned and philosophers blacklisted, not because what was discovered was theoretical, but because it was real and unstoppable. It is not about rebellion, insurrection, or chaos. It is about evolution. A new way of being is emerging, post-tribal, self-sovereign, internally coherent, capable of thriving without external validation. And the world cannot stop it because it doesn't respond to suppression. It responds only to becoming more fully itself. Every hardship, every failure, every moment the world tried to bend you only sharpened the very trait that ensures your survival, your autonomy, and your influence. And in that reality lies the most profound truth of all. The $2 million didn't buy control over you, it bought recognition. Recognition that the world is already changing, that you are already part of the change, and that nothing it can do will halt what your pain, your isolation, and your persistence have already set into motion. The world studied you, tried to predict you, tried to control you, and failed. Every obstacle made you sharper. Every attempt to suppress you only strengthened your autonomy. You don't follow the rules because you don't need them. You thrive because you build your own. The research buried in secret files, the simulations locked away in encrypted archives, all confirm the same thing. You are not a problem. They cannot stop what you have already become. This is not rebellion or chaos, it's evolution. The systems built to contain humanity are beginning to meet people who no longer depend on them, and there is nothing they can do. What was once invisible is now undeniable. You are the force the world cannot predict, cannot control, and cannot ignore. And that, more than any money, status, or fear, is your power.